There are words that were not written to comfort, but to ignite dormant memories. And there are verses you've repeated your whole life without ever truly reading them. I don't speak as just another interpreter of the text, but as someone who has spent years comparing manuscripts, deconstructing translations, observing what has been omitted between one word and another. I didn't come to reinforce the canon. I came to traverse it. And if you stay here until the end, perhaps you will discover that the Gospel of John was never a book about worship, but about recognition. You've heard John 11 more times than you can remember. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So familiar it's become invisible. But I ask you, with all the seriousness that this question demands, have you ever read it outside the mold they gave you? Have you ever allowed yourself to question the obvious? Have you ever compared the Greek with the translation they put in your hand as if it were definitive? In the ancient manuscript, there is no word as a spoken word. There is logos. And logos is not language, not discourse, not sound. Logos is living structure, organizing principle, intelligence that sustains the form of all that exists. When John writes in the beginning was the logos, he is not saying that God began by speaking. He is saying that before time, before matter, before history, there already existed a structuring consciousness. Not created, not derived, not subordinated. Existing. And then he writes something even more disturbing: the logos waspros God. Not with, as in two bodies close together. Prosit is direction, guidance, face-to-face presence. The logos is not beside the source. He turns towards it in continuous communion, as if there were no boundary between what emanates and what originates. And then John delivers the final blow: the logos was God. Not similar. Not sent. He was. I'm not here to sugarcoat it. I'm here to tell you that this phrase wasn't written to be tamed into Sunday sermons. It's the crack in the entire edifice of separation. Now breathe and follow with me the silent movement that John performs, almost imperceptible to those who read too quickly. He is not describing a distant miracle. He is describing a primordial state. The infinite source does not create something outside of itself. It expresses itself. The monad does not divide. It emanates without losing unity. Logos is not a servant. It is the living expression of being itself. And then, when you're already comfortable with the idea of an elevated, untouchable Christ, separate from all that is human, John writes, and the Word became flesh. Not as a cosmic exception. Not as theological theater. As a revelation of possibility. Stop for a moment. Let this sentence pierce through your defenses. The organizing principle of the universe didn't visit flesh. It became flesh. And if you accept this as something that happened only once, you haven't read John. You've merely repeated the authorized version. This is where I begin to speak from within the text, not about it. I read what has been forcibly kept hidden between twisted lines. I see what they tried to cover with dogma. And I tell you, the church needed to transform this into worship, because if it were understood as recognition, the entire hierarchy would crumble. In the same chapter, John writes something that is rarely read to the end: but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Most people stop here. But I don't stop. I continue. Who were born, not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. Not adopted. Not elevated by merit. Begotten from the same source. If you feel discomfort hearing this, it's because a literal reading threatens the identity you've been taught to protect. I'm not offering comfort. I'm offering displacement. The idea that you are a creature seeking divine approval is functional for institutions. The idea that you are consciousness emanating from the source itself is too explosive to be taught. Perhaps that's why you've been trained to read without questioning, to accept without comparing, to repeat without investigating. But you're not here by chance. You're here because something within you began to distrust the framework. If this text has already provoked in you a fissure, a strange silence, a nameless recognition, leave a comment with the word "remember." Not as a ritual, but as a mark of presence. This is not engagement. It is tracking consciousness. And now I ask you, do not rush. Do not seek ready-made answers. Do not try to solve this as a theological problem. Allow the question to remain open within you, like a contained flame. If the Logos is the consciousness that structures everything, if the Logos became flesh, and if those who receive it are generated from the same source, who have you been by accepting to live as if you were separate? Keep that question in mind. Don't turn it into a conclusion just yet. Because what follows doesn't just expand on the text. It shifts the very idea of who you think you are. Perhaps you closed the previous video and went back to your routine as if nothing had happened. You opened another tab, answered messages, crossed the street watching the traffic light, went into the supermarket, chose the same coffee as always. But something felt different, even if you can't yet say what. That's how Joao's text works, not through external shock, but through internal unease. It doesn't impose itself. It infiltrates. I've been following this movement for years. I see ordinary people, drivers, teachers, exhausted mothers, young people tired of repeating their own history, begin to feel a sudden unease when rereading a verse they thought they had mastered. One of them once wrote to me saying that he was reading John on the bus, between stops, when he got stuck on the phrase "born of God." He closed the book because he felt afraid. Not of God, but of the possibility that it wasn't a metaphor. He didn't want to lose the safety of distance. You've experienced something like this before. Maybe not with the Bible, but with life. A day when everything seemed the same, until a phrase struck you uninvited. A conversation, a movie, a prolonged silence in a dark room. Nothing changed on the outside, but you were no longer the same on the inside. John describes exactly this when he writes that those who receive the Logos are not born of the will of the flesh nor of man. He's not talking about religion. He's talking about origin, about something that doesn't begin when you decide, but when you remember. The church translated this as being born again and turned it into a rite, a moment, an isolated event. But notice how your own experience disproves this idea. The real transformations in your life didn't happen on set dates. They emerged as silent ruptures. You realized you could no longer tolerate certain conversations, that certain ambitions no longer made sense, that some fears lost their power without you having done anything special. It wasn't conversion. It was displacement. Joao uses a word that is rarely explored: generate. Don't transform. Don't convert. Generate. You don't become something new. You emerge from what you always were, but which was buried under layers of adaptation. Think about how many times you silenced an intuition to fit in. How many times you accepted living less so as not to bother anyone. How many times you called yourself weak when, in reality, you were just tired of fighting against your own nature. Perhaps that's why Jesus' words about being born of the Spirit confuse Nicodemus. He thinks of the womb, of biology, of an impossible return. Jesus speaks of consciousness. He speaks of water and spirit. Water as the world in which you were shaped, expectations, pressures, invisible inheritances. Spirit as that which begins to remember itself behind all of that. It's not a second birth. It's an unveiling. You know the feeling of living on autopilot, waking up, repeating tasks, responding to demands, postponing important questions. This isn't a lack of faith. It's too much noise. John describes the same condition when he speaks of people who see the light but don't recognize it. The light isn't lacking. What's lacking is inner understanding. I don't present this as a mystical promise, but as a human observation. When someone begins to honestly examine their own weariness, when they realize they are not exhausted from working, but from pretending to be something they are not, a shift occurs. It's not beautiful, it's not luminous, it's not photogenic. It's lonely, it's confusing. And it is precisely there that John's text ceases to be theology and becomes a mirror. There's a silent shift in this process that almost no one notices. You start to feel strange in the places you once called home. Superficial conversations become tiresome. Empty promises irritate. Not because you've gotten better, but because something within you has stopped negotiating with falsehood. It's at this point that many retreat. They prefer to return to the comfort of the official explanation, where everything is clear, predictable, hierarchical. But João doesn't write for those who want predictability. He writes for those who are willing to navigate their own disorientation. I've watched people lose their footing, not because they abandoned their beliefs, but because they realized they had never truly chosen them. They had only inherited them. If you begin to feel that certain words no longer fit in your mouth, that certain social roles no longer explain who you are, this is not a spiritual crisis. It is deep reading. It is the logos pressing against the surface. Don't try to organize this now. Don't look for a method. Don't seek a technique. Just observe how you react to daily life after touching on these ideas. See how you walk down the same street, but with a different inner silence. See how an old passage gains a different weight when you stop asking, "What does this mean?" and start asking, "What does this do to me?" And as you navigate this strangeness, hold on to this simple image. You're not trying to climb to some distant place. You're simply ceasing to pretend you were born separate, because the rupture you feel isn't loss, it's remembrance. You may be starting to notice a curious phenomenon the closer you get to the text. The less it looks like a book, and the more it looks like a mirror. It's no longer John speaking, nor me, it's something within you that begins to respond even before the sentence is finished. It is at this point that many interrupt their reading, not for lack of interest, but for an excess of recognition. The mind likes concepts, but resists truths that destabilize the persona it has been maintaining for years. I spent a lot of time observing how people deal with this moment. Some laugh nervously, as if it were all just a poetic metaphor. Others get irritated, attack the messenger, ask for references, ask for external permission to feel what they are already feeling. Most simply close the book and say it's not for them, not because they didn't understand, but because they understood too much. Have you ever found yourself defending an identity you didn't even know you chose? Have you ever argued in favor of a role you simply inherited from your family, culture, or religion? Have you ever felt that you live according to expectations that don't bear your name, but govern your every decision? John doesn't write to please this kind of defense. When he records Jesus' words about the bread of life, he is dismantling the entire logic of external dependence. I am the bread, not I have. He doesn't offer something to be consumed. He presents himself as a state of consciousness to be recognized. The church transformed this into rite, into substance, into a repeatable ceremony, but in human experience, bread was never the object. Bread has always been the hunger that ceases to be projected outward. I've seen people cry when they realize they've spent their whole lives searching for something outside of themselves, something in others, in faith, in success, in money, not because it doesn't exist, but because it's not separate. The idea of eating the bread of life isn't poetic, it's brutal. It affirms that what you seek doesn't come to you, it emerges when you stop being absent from yourself. What if the hunger you feel isn't for more information, but for less escapism? What if what you call a spiritual quest is just an attempt to distract yourself from the fact that you've never fully inhabited yourself? When John uses the expression ego eimi, he is not creating a religious title, he is opening an inner space. Eim does not describe a character, it describes presence, and presence cannot be accumulated, stored, or delegated. Have you ever noticed how difficult it is to be fully present in a simple moment? Like having a coffee without checking your phone, or walking without projecting yourself into the future. This is not modern distraction, it is the ancient resistance to perceiving oneself as consciousness in action. There's a subtle shift that happens when someone begins to understand this. Death ceases to be a distant threat and starts to be questioned in its very definition. If what you are is reduced to the body, then death is the end. But if what you are is the very capacity to be present, then death is merely the interruption of a form, not of that which forms it. Have you ever wondered why the fear of death almost never appears in moments of deep presence, but only when the mind begins to project itself back into the future? John doesn't write about immortality as a future promise, he writes about present recognition. Whoever eats this bread will not die, not as a miracle, but as a change in self-identification. I have accompanied people who lost someone and, paradoxically, felt an unprecedented clarity about their own lives. They didn't become more religious, they became more real, less attached to the narrative, more attentive to the present moment. This is not resignation, it is logos in action. The text doesn't ask you to believe, it asks you to perceive. There's a vast difference between accepting an idea and allowing it to permeate how you live. When someone truly begins to recognize themselves as consciousness and not just as biography, something breaks in how they react to the world. Conflicts diminish, not because the world changes, but because the internal axis ceases to be negotiable. If you weren't the story you tell about yourself, who would be here now? Who would be reading these words if there were no past to defend, no future to protect, no role to uphold. There's a silent moment in this journey when a person realizes they don't need to become something extraordinary, they just need to stop hiding behind the ordinary. That's not enlightenment, it's not glory, it's not superiority, it's raw simplicity, and perhaps that's why so few remain. There's no applause for those who stop pretending. I know that, as you read, part of you wants to turn this into a method, a technique, a practical path. But John doesn't offer maps, he offers mirrors, and mirrors don't teach, they reflect. If logos is not something you attain, but something you are, what exactly have you done with your life so far? There was one manuscript that impressed me more than any other. It wasn't rare, nor luxurious, nor protected by glass, was in a forgotten library of a European monastery, catalogued as a late commentary of no relevance. The pages were stained, the ink uneven, but in one margin, almost erased, someone had written in the 4th century, "If this is read literally, the church will lose control." There was no signature, just this warning, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, was there. That I realized that suppression didn't only happen through councils and bonfires, it occurred in silent rooms, among weary scribes, pressured translators, monks who knew exactly what they were erasing when they exchanged one word for another. They didn't remove the text, they adjusted the lens. John writes, "Before Abraham was, I am." You may have heard this hundreds of times. But almost no one dwells on the most unsettling detail. There is no past there is no I was, there is continuous presence, not located in time, the everyday world. This seems like just a strange phrase, but when one begins to observe their own mind, they realize something disconcerting. Every memory is now, every anticipation is now, every fear is now. Time doesn't pass through you, you pass through internal representations of time. I met a woman who worked in an emergency room. 20 years dealing with emergencies, deaths, accidents. She told me that the hardest part of her job wasn't seeing someone die, but seeing how people live as if they weren't there. They only realize their presence when they're about to lose it. She said, Joao didn't write for those who only awaken at their limit. He wrote for those who decide not to postpone their own awareness. When Jesus says, "I and the Father are one," the church reacts with theology, but the real effect of this phrase is not doctrinal. It is existential. If the source and the expression are one and the same, then the feeling of being separated is not a moral error, it is a misinterpretation. You don't feel distant from God because you have failed. You feel distant because you have been trained to interpret your own experience as insufficient. There are curious records of 2nd century Christian communities that read John as an internal guide. They didn't use pulpits or altars. They met in homes, in silence. And each person read the text looking for where it resonated within themselves. They weren't seeking theological agreement, but recognition. Many of these groups disappeared without leaving an institutional trace, but they left vestiges in personal letters. One of them, found on an ostracon in Egypt, simply says, "I didn't find him outside. He started to show himself when I stopped looking for him." This type of reading could never survive in a system based on hierarchy, because when someone recognizes that the presence that sustains the world is the same one that sustains their own attention now, the logic of submission loses its meaning. Not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. Have you ever noticed how, in moments of mindfulness, there are no problems to be solved, only reality to be lived? And how, in those moments, there is no effort to be someone else? The self dissolves not into emptiness, but into clarity. John 17:21 does not call for unity as an ideal. It describes unity as a natural condition when the correct interpretation occurs, that they may all be one, just as I and the Father are one, not to create followers, but to dissolve the idea that there is something to be followed outside of oneself. I knew a man who spent 40 years in a rigid religion, knew every ritual, every dogma. One day, during a casual reading of John, he stopped at the passage where Jesus says that the kingdom of God does not come with outward appearance. He closed the book and remained motionless for almost an hour. Afterwards, he wrote to me saying, "I spent my whole life waiting for something to happen. I never realized that what I was waiting for was already happening while I was waiting." This isn't sudden enlightenment, it's decompression. It's like releasing a muscle that's been tense for decades without you realizing it. Joao's text does that. It doesn't add layers, it removes them, and the more you remove, the less likely the idea becomes that you are merely a collection of roles, functions, and memories. That everyday experience begins to change texture. It doesn't get easier, but it becomes more genuine. You start listening to people without being so defensive, walking without rushing to arrive, feeling without immediately labeling. This is the danger the church has always feared, not because people become rebellious, but because they become whole, and whole people don't need to be led. They simply are. If something within you begins to perceive this now, don't try to name it, don't turn it into a belief, just observe how, for a moment, you don't need to prove anything to anyone in that instant. Perhaps you are closer to what John tried to record than to any explanation you have ever heard. There was a moment in history when the direct reading of John almost disappeared, not because the text had been lost, but because the courage to confront it without protection began to dwindle. The century progressed, temples grew, hierarchies solidified, and something silently changed. Experience was replaced by official interpretation. With each generation, fewer people read to recognize, and more read to confirm what they had already been told. I found traces of this in letters that never reached the pulpits, in diaries that were never canonized. A young scribe from Syria, in the year 312, wrote that his master had been warned for insisting on explaining John without resorting to accepted theology. He does not deny Jesus, the complaint said, but he makes him too close. Too close. That was the real threat. Can you imagine the scene? A simple man, perhaps a craftsman, perhaps a farmer, hearing that I and the Father are one was not a distant exception, but a state of affairs. What would he do the next day? Would you continue asking permission to exist? Would you continue kneeling in fear? Would you continue living as if you were separate from that which sustains you? That is why, throughout the centuries, the reading of John has been surrounded by explanations, footnotes, commentaries, and warnings. The book could not be banned, so the book was surrounded by invisible walls, but invisible walls only work as long as no one notices they're there. Perhaps that's why you're feeling a kind of internal acceleration right now. It's not anxiety, it's the tension of something starting to align, like when a misplaced piece slowly returns to its place and the whole system starts to function differently. Joao doesn't write to generate progressive comfort, he writes to provoke a gradual collapse of the certainties that maintain distance. There's a specific turning point I see happening frequently. The person begins to reread their own history and realizes they never sought God, they sought permission to err, to feel, to exist as they are. But when they understand that the logos is not a prize to be received, but a reality to be recognized, this search changes direction. It's no longer how do I get there, but why did I believe I was far away? This question doesn't bring immediate peace, it brings disorganization. The person begins to look at their relationships and realizes how many are based on neediness, not on presence. They look at their career and see how many choices were made to feel sufficient, not to express who they are. They look at their faith and notice how much it was built to maintain a safe distance from their own conscience. This is where many give up, not out of weakness, but out of honesty, because recognizing the logos within oneself is not about gaining power, it's about losing excuses. You stop being able to blame the past, the system, the institution, even God, for what you haven't experienced. There are accounts of people who, upon reaching this point, felt something akin to grief, not because they lost someone, but because they realized they had spent decades relating to a diminished version of themselves. One of them told me, I'm not sad about what I lost, but about what I accepted to be. John doesn't explicitly say this, but it's impossible to read his gospel without experiencing this kind of internal farewell. The rhythm of the text intensifies because the separation begins to fail. You can no longer pretend that certain questions don't exist. You can no longer hear you are God's and turn it into a comfortable metaphor. You can no longer repeat the logos became flesh and maintain the idea that this has nothing to do with you. And then fear arises, not religious fear, but existential fear. The fear of living without the shield of insignificance. The fear of discovering that no one will save you from being who you are. The fear that there is no longer a place to hide behind labels, positions, beliefs, or titles. This is the point of greatest tension. It's when the old interpretation still tries to impose itself, offering shortcuts. Go back to what it was before, accept the known interpretation. Don't go so deep, but something in you no longer obeys so easily. Something has begun to see through the lens. I can't tell you what you'll do with this. Some distance themselves for a while and then return. Others move on silently, without telling anyone. What I do know is that no one gets through this passage from John unscathed when they read it without a filter. If you're here now, following along to this point, it's no coincidence. Something within you has already sensed that the end of this journey isn't theoretical, it's personal, and it's drawing near. We've reached a point where it's no longer possible to just listen. Everything read so far begins to demand movement, not outward, but inward. John didn't write a belief system, he wrote a roadmap for return, and every roadmap only fulfills its purpose when someone decides to take the first step. Perhaps you are sitting here in silence, with a feeling that is difficult to name. It is not euphoria, it is not pure fear, it is not certainty. It is as if something ancient is trying to remember itself through you. This feeling does not come from outside, it is born when you stop interpreting and begin to perceive. That is exactly what the Gospel of John proposes, not that you accept something new, but that you stop denying what has always been at work within you. Putting this into practice doesn't require rituals or secret formulas. It requires attention. Tomorrow, when you wake up, before touching your phone, Spend a few seconds simply noticing that you are here. Don't think about who you are, or what you need to do, just notice the simple fact of being conscious. This moment has no history, no biography, no character, is the same now and always, throughout the day. Observe how many times you get lost in automatic reactions, in arguments that arise out of nowhere, in quick judgments, in defenses you don't even know why you built. Every time this happens, don't fight it, just notice it. Perception is already logos in action. You don't need to correct the mind, you need to see it. Night, as you lie in bed, don't do a moral assessment of your day. Don't criticize yourself, just observe which moments you were present and which ones you lived on autopilot. No guilt, no reward, just internal reflection. John doesn't ask for perfection, he invites honesty. If you do this for a few days, something subtle will begin to change. You won't become better, you'll become more real. Some relationships will lose strength, others will deepen. Certain ambitions will cease to make sense, not because you gave up, but because you stopped projecting yourself onto versions of yourself that no longer match what is beginning to emerge. This is the true return to the source, not a mystical ecstasy, but a silent shift in identity. You stop defining yourself solely by what you do, what you have, what you've lost. You begin to recognize yourself as the space where all of this happens, and when that happens, the old separation begins to dissolve effortlessly. John never asked you to worship words, he asked you to transcend them. Each I am recorded in the text is an invitation for you to encounter yourself before any role, before any name, before any fear. Perhaps you've spent your life waiting for some external sign that you were on the right path, an event, an answer, a fulfilled promise, but the sign has always been simply the ability to be whole for a moment, without needing to explain yourself. If something within you recognizes this now, don't let that feeling get lost in the routine. Carry it into the next simple gesture, into the next conversation, into the next silence. That's how logos ceases to be a concept and becomes an experience. If this video changed the way you see yourself, like it now. If you want, comment, even anonymously, on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of reading, recognition, and feedback. Joao wrote, for those willing to remember, perhaps you are one of them.